Good morning, everyone. My name's Peter Decina. I hope people can hear me. Let me just make sure that you're going to see the screen. Yes, good morning. This first presentation is going to be a lectorial, meaning I'm hoping that partway through, on 2 or 3 occasions, that you will contribute to the discussions by answering questions and thinking about your own practice or your own teaching, or the teaching that you'll be doing in future. And Jamie did say that that although this is UK based in many ways, I'm going to say this first talk has 3 headline educational theories, one of which, the core one, Decoding the Disciplines, is very commonly used in the United States of America, Canada, and in Europe and Australia. So this is something that is emerging in the UK, but is well established elsewhere. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And you can see 3 headline educational theories there: threshold concepts, decoding the disciplines, and backward design. And I'm going to show you how we can think about using those educational theories to take theory into our practice in the classroom and for assessing students. But there is one other educational theory that's in, I suppose, the subtext, which is constructive alignment. It's about how you line up what you think is your content, the concepts you want to teach, with the assessment that you do. So 3.5 educational theories, really. Let's progress so that you can understand the whole point of decoding the disciplines. Education has changed enormously over the last 40 or 50 years. Looking at the left, actually some of those systems were still in place and might still be in place in some universities, but I am going to tell you the hard truth, and that is that many of you will find that you are teaching very large classes, that education has changed enormously, and that you might not know the students in the way that your tutors will have known you. And you've got to expect to experience that. That makes teaching and also learning quite different to how it has been in the past. And the principles from sorting to educating are also something which we can consider during this presentation. But what I want to do is to talk about how we think through problems. And this is about helping your students with transition. How are you going to teach them the steps that they need in order to succeed as a historian? Well, David Pace, who's one of the great gurus on decoding the disciplines, has lent me a number of slides, and I've worked closely with him for the last decade or so. And so thanks to him. But here's a really very simple example. We learn automatically what to do if the light goes out. Well, the light doesn't work. We check, is it plugged in? And if no, we plug it in. If not, after we've plugged it in, we check if the bulb's burnt out. If it is, then we replace the bulb. If it's not, then we know that we have to go through something more complex to repair the lamp, either ourselves, fix the fuse, or send it off, or just admit defeat on it. But those are steps, those are processes that you learn. They are not something that is automatic. Now, I use that as a metaphor for thinking about how we learn how to, inverted commas, do our discipline. Very simple metaphor. But let's talk about the first of those educational theories. At the Institute of Education in the University of London, which is now part of UCL, Myron Land talked about threshold concepts. Almost 2 decades ago, they were thinking about the ways in which people went from one state of being to another. In other words, learning how to understand and how to do. And threshold concepts are quite different in different disciplines. But we know for ourselves that sometimes we have to struggle to do some things, but sometimes we take to other tasks very, very quickly and easily. In other words, we go through this state of not knowing to a state of knowing. So we master a number of threshold concepts in every discipline. So there's our first educational theory. I'm going to give you just a very few extracts, which I think are pertinent from Meyer and Land. They, amongst other things, have said that it's about a state of being. It's changing who we are to be able to do something new. It becomes a part of us. In other words, it's transformative. And the second point is that very often when we learn, let's say we learn how to ride a bike, we're unlikely to forget it. And we just need to just get on the bike and do it again in order to be able to master it. But the third thing, and I want you to consider this, is that there is an idea that there is troublesome knowledge in every discipline. And the reason Meyer and Land called it troublesome knowledge is because sometimes what they are asking you to do in order to be good in any discipline is to think in a counterintuitive way. I'll give you an example of that later on, but do keep that in your mind, that what is easy for us in doing our discipline is quite troublesome for our students. In fact, sometimes just reading is troublesome for them. Here are some examples of threshold concepts in other disciplines. Now, deliberately left history out of this, and so hopefully Jamie is monitoring the chat. I want you, just if you want to type in something that you think is troublesome or difficult for 18 and 19-year-olds to learn and do when they come into doing a history degree in a university or higher education. So please do type in, and Jamie will be able to monitor and tell us your thoughts. But you can see here are some troublesome knowledge or threshold concepts in other academic disciplines.
Shall I read some of the?
Yeah, read some out, Jamie. Yeah, it's easier.
Historiography got two right away. Historiography, building an argument, engaging with primary sources, time management, which I think is universal when you're a lecturer, footnoting, taking notes, being independent, subaltern history. So absolutely. Reading critically, engaging with theory, looking at alternative points of view, post-colonial perspectives and decolonial perspectives, subjectivity, researching offline, so I guess not just using Google, arguments, pictures of dead people, paying attention for long enough, paraphrasing, I guess, rather than just copying stuff out, being empathetic, critical thinking, writing, independent thinking, memory in inverted commas, theory again, method v sources.
You know, I'm going to stop you there, Jamie.
Yeah, pretty much.
I can feel an article coming on. This is fabulous stuff, isn't it? Because one of the things that I know that when I've seen others talk about this is we've all come to the conclusion that actually history and learning in any discipline, transition, is hard. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Thank you for that. We'll come back to all of these. They're not lost. And if you liked some of the contributions of others, do hang on to them, because I'm going to ask you to think through something which will help you in your own practice later on. But let's have a look at liminal states, which is also a part of Meyer and Land's work. Okay, what they're saying is this, that between the stages of not being able to do and being able to master troublesome knowledge, you are sometimes in a space where sometimes you're able to do it and sometimes you're not. In other words, you're in this sort of corridor of uncertainty. This is a liminal space, educationally speaking. And they use the simile of it being rather like adolescence. You're not yet an adult, but yet sometimes you're able to do adult things, but sometimes you revert to not being able to do, in other words, more as a childish state of being. So how are you going to be assured, and how are your students going to be assured that they're not just temporarily performing or mastering a threshold concept, that they're not just staying in a liminal space? How are they going to be able to go through from one to another? Well, let's explore this. Just about 20 years ago, in the University of Indiana history department, they were thinking through the problem of what do they do to make sure that 18-year-olds have successfully gone through from school into university. In other words, they were looking at transition. And they called this the freshman, meaning the first year project. And they thought of the liminal states, the troublesome knowledge, and they thought what they might need to do is to decode the disciplines. In other words, decode what we do as historians, to make explicit each step that we as experts do, make them explicit to students so that they could learn how to become historians. So this is our second educational theory, which comes from the United States. It's about 20 years old. And I put some of the seminal reading there on Decoding the Disciplines, and a picture there of David Pace, who you'll be able to go to his Decoding the Disciplines website if you want to. But here's a really interesting example of something which is troublesome and often counterintuitive. There was a famous article 6 years ago in a magazine called American Life about a Nobel Prize winning physicist who got Alzheimer's, and he forgot how to do what we think are basic things. For example, he forgot how to read an analog clock. Well, have a look at the analog clock. I'm not going to ask you to put in the chat what the time is, because you should know, obviously, because it's obvious to us. We look at it and we think, there it is. It's the classic 10 past 10. But let's look at troublesome knowledge, shall we? There is, though, the superimposition of three types of information going on here. And actually, there's a fourth type there, I can see, because there's an alarm. So you can see there are 4 hands in this clock. But 2 of them are actual hands. If you were looking or reading this, it's counterintuitive because you go to the larger one, but actually you need to repress that and go to the shorthand to look at the hour, except there are only 12. And then when we read the longhand, each unit represents 5 minutes. I'm using this really very basic example to show you something about troublesome knowledge and things that we might take for granted. Because of course, when you teach somebody to read an analog, you have to break down the knowledge in order to be able to go through a set of processes that will allow someone to learn how to read an analog clock effectively. And a lot of this is actually counterintuitive. Now, if this doesn't work, if we're not able to hear the video, and actually I'm going to go to this one. If we're not able to hear this, then I'm able to skim over. But this is worth listening to. I'll try this, Jamie, shall I?
Yeah, give it a go. Yeah, I'm afraid that I can't hear that. I don't know about everyone else.
No. I'm going to. Right. You will be able to hear that when you get the slides. And that's one of the historians at Indiana talking about decoding the disciplines. But this allows us to have more interactivity. So there's absolutely no worry. There's always a plan B. Here is what the historians at the University of Indiana came up with in thinking about a strategy for decoding the disciplines. And I'd like you to look at the Decoding the Disciplines wheel, because we are going to go through the first 5 steps together. And I'm going to pause to ask you for what your ideas are in going through this wheel to support your students. Let's have a look at step number 1. Step number 1 is about identifying the things that your students consistently fail to master. So, identify a place in a course where the learning of students is blocked. This is what the Indiana theorists call the bottleneck. Identify the bottleneck. And I have to tell you that the best way to identify a bottleneck is not necessarily to think about it yourself, but to talk to someone who is not a historian. They will ask you how it is that you've come to a conclusion or been able to perform a particular task in order to understand a historical event. And then you will then have to think to yourself in number 2, well, what do specialists do to get past this bottleneck? Okay, well, I've actually asked you to do this. I've asked you to do this earlier in thinking about threshold concepts, but I'm going to ask you to just come up with one now in your own mind, one bottleneck that you think many students consistently fail to master, that is crucial to them becoming a historian and mastering an operation to do history. Anyone like to put anything in the chat? Anything other than you've put in already? Do some scribbling, put it in the chat. Jamie will monitor it. Just think of one of the top things that you think is a bottleneck.
Paleography, I think.
Say that again, Jamie.
Paleography.
Yes.
Understanding the craft of history, referencing, taking things at face value, time management, reading primary sources, developing their own arguments, understanding the difference between change and continuity, arguments, finding their own materials for their own research, reading critically, knowing the difference between primary and secondary sources, effectively reading secondary literature, managing conflicting information.
Okay, we'll stop there, Jamie.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to ask everyone to do something really very, very old-fashioned now, and that is get a piece of paper, get a pen or a pencil, get yourself drawing a circle, and I'd like you to at least put number 1 at the top, which is bottleneck, and put your bottleneck in the top of these 7 stages in your circle or the cycle. Don't worry, you'll see this cycle again. It's not going to disappear. You'll be able to see the 7 stages later, but the top one is your own bottleneck. And I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds to pause, because I'm going to talk you through the next slide. I'm going to show you a bottleneck. Have a look at this. Have a look at the picture on the right-hand side. A number of you, and certainly I have done this, have used images in my teaching. And I've often asked people to read art as text, to tell me what it means, what it tells us as a source, what it can contribute to our understanding of the past. Anyone like to tell me about that particular image? What do they see? Because one of the bottlenecks is understanding the meanings plural, of primary sources. Some people give a narrative, a description, but some people are able to
so we've got
place it in its context.
So in the chat, we've got still life, luxury, opulence, source of someone's wealth, increased interest in Chinese goods and style, a rich collection of materials and goods from a range of places, trade, royal, left in a hurry, a finished meal.
Yeah, actually, the left in a hurry is a really interesting one because it shows a sign of decadence, that even though there is this opulence, there is the, well, I'm so wealthy, I don't mind. But this is the ginger jar from the 1670s. And actually what nobody said, unless you've missed it, is that there is a watch there as well, if you look closely at the bottom left, which shows that someone was so wealthy they had a watch. This is 1670s. But you know, there are all sorts of artistic styles that you would need to convey. But I'm glad people have come up with trade, because you've got the Levantine rug, you've got the ginger jar, which means trade, and in fact ginger was a clear luxury. The crystal glass, and other people would talk about light and shade, and you know, Dutch styles. Okay, look, our problem as historians is this, and you've given really very good answers, because I actually do this with a group of early career academics who are not historians, because I want them to think about the difference between just giving a mere description and giving contextual information, because this actually tells us a lot about global trade and the 17th century. Really rather interesting. But the trouble with us, and I'm saying us meaning you as well, because you're here, and ipso facto you are already expert, is that you all know too much. But what you've got to realize is that you've got to break down what you know and what you can do and what you see to your students. So let's go to the next part of this. Okay, I've asked you in step 1 to think of a bottleneck, and you've seen that what perhaps I would do if I was using images is I would break down by looking at the content and style of that picture, but use it as an opportunity to talk about Dutch trade, about wealth, about mercantile interests, about the Dutch East India Company, and so on and so forth. Now, I want you to do this. Think to yourself, what would you do to get past the bottleneck that you have identified? What steps would you take? Now, I'm going to give you the most simple metaphor. Imagine you are teaching someone to change gear in an automatic car. You've got to break it down, putting your foot on the clutch, looking to see whether you need to decrease or increase speed, seeing if there's a child in the road, seeing traffic lights are coming up, moving up or down with your left hand. So can you see how many things you have to think about that you are doing in order to get past the bottleneck of changing up or down gear? What would you do? I know a number of people have mentioned paleography, referencing, whatever else. Think of what you would do. And then I'm going to ask someone in a couple of minutes to tell everyone what they might think of doing. Okay, if you've done that, let's go to the next one. Well, the problem is that it's not always straightforward in telling people what you do, because what we do implicitly as historians sometimes is difficult to break down and make explicit. And you can see here quite clearly that when I said this was an international theory now, or set of theories, that I've given you some examples and references of how decoding the disciplines has spread across different disciplines and into different universities, including Bielefeld. What I like here is that sometimes it's so hard that it's almost like a miracle occurs. Okay. One of the things that decoding theorists have done is to create a set of interviews based on that the 7 steps in the cycle. Now, one of the things that I did was when I went through to a workshop organised by Joan Middendorf, who was on the video, the earlier video, was I was paired up with an astronomer. And he explained to me what the bottleneck was in first year astronomy for most of his students. And I explained what was problematic and difficult, a bottleneck, for first year history undergraduates. And lo and behold, we found that we had very, very similar ground, even though on the face of it, the disciplines are so different. And we were talking about to each other about what we would do to break down the problem. It was really very useful talking to someone who was not a historian. And he said the same about talking to someone who was not an astronomer, because he had to step back and think about what is it that he does? What is it that he does do? And how can he break it down? And what emerged from those interviews is that what comes naturally to us is not necessarily natural to an 18 or 19-year-old student. And that we have to break down into a series of mental operations what they need to do to get past the bottleneck. So I'm now going to invite people, if you want, to maybe share what they would do to break down and model in front of your students what you do as a historian to get through the bottleneck that they are experiencing. Would anyone like to say what they would like to do to model those operations for students? How would you get them to reference? How would you get them to time manage? How would you get them to move through the troublesome knowledge of paleography? Any offers?
So we've got something in the chat.
Okay, read it out, then.
Collaborative close reading of a primary source with the students. So
yes,
like working alongside them, I guess.
Yes.
A good one, like using charts. So I guess kind of mapping it out for them, like in the way that you're doing for us now, I guess. So you can see it, the process. Providing them with some examples so they can model their work. So examples, using your own experience as an example. Show how to take notes. So show how you read an article or a chapter. What do you pick up when you're doing it? So I get like explicitly modeling it for them. Creating categories with which students can organize new information. So providing them with shortcuts in a way, giving them examples of good referencing or bibliography, create practice sheets or exercises that make them find and make references. So giving them sort of like worksheets in a way, I guess, that help them to kind of practice.
What has emerged? Thank you, Jamie. What has emerged from this, and you will see this when you look at the video, is that actually there are 1,000 different ways in which you can address different bottlenecks. And the people decoding the disciplines often say that what you should do is to be quite creative and cast your net wide in thinking of ways to support your students, because one strategy might not work, whereas another will. I'll give you an example. When it came to referencing and writing, I found that I would set my students a really very, very short in-class exercise where I would take references away from a piece of short text that came from an article and ask them where the references should go. That's one example. And then I would sometimes ask them to create a 200-word piece and no more. It had to be 200 words. In other words, a very short, self-contained piece of writing, so that they would be focused and make an argument to develop one particular point. So you can use a whole number of strategies, and Jamie will have worked on that close reading, I know, from his work about 4 or 5 years ago, I think it was, Jamie. And there are other examples as well. But here's the big trick. Once you have modeled those operations for students, have a look at number 4. What are you going to do to get them to practice it and get feedback on each of these operations? And then number 5, what can I do to motivate students? Because the part of the problem is that students will find it difficult. They won't necessarily succeed and they might give up. So that's the real big challenge in the decoding cycle. And that's about being someone who is really empathetic to the students failing. And that's managing failure or managing them through that liminal state, if you like. So let's have a look at this. What you should do with students is to model the kinds of mental operation that they need to bring to your work that you're setting them, give them practice, and then give them feedback and feed forward. Notice I use the feed forward phrase in order to tell them what they can do to improve their performance so that they can succeed in mastering and going through that threshold concept to master the troublesome knowledge. Now, I did say that there were 3 educational theories, and this one actually aligns itself to the decoding the disciplines paradigm really very well. And this is very commonly used in the United States and in Germany. So really not UK based, although we do have constructive alignment. John Biggs, if you look at John Biggs's work on constructive alignment, really it starts at the beginning about what it is we want to teach and think carefully about the design of the assessment. But here's another take on authentic assessment that came out of the work of Wiggins and McTighe from 2005 onwards. They called it backward design. And they thought, rather like reading the newspaper backwards, what is it that you think is the desired result for your student? Because once you're able to think about the super goal in what you are teaching your students, then you can think, well, what would be acceptable evidence? And I'm going to challenge you by saying that maybe writing an essay for 1 hour is not necessarily acceptable evidence that they get it, that they have mastered historical concepts. So you need to be thinking creatively about assessments, and there's a lot of work on creative assessment. In fact, there will be some sessions on that in this conference this week. From there, you need to think, well, if that's the acceptable evidence, then you plan backwards into your meetings with them to what you are going to teach them, what their experiences will be in the class and also out of the class in what we might call directed activities. So think about backward design. Here are 2 more ways of thinking about backward design. What do I want? Look at the right-hand side. What do I want the students to understand and be able to do? How do I check? Meaning, what is the best type of assessment? And what do I do in the classroom? So what we've got so far today is we've got a number of educational theories which are aligned. We've got threshold concepts, decoding the disciplines, and backward design. I hope you can see how they go together. I'm now going to ask you, actually, which I think is one of the most difficult, which is, now that you have thought of the bottleneck, you have thought about how you would model your expert processes in the classroom for your students, I want to know what forms of assessment would you create so that you would be able to know and they will be able to know and also practice mastering, and I'm trying to think of what you said, paleography, referencing, etc., etc. So can you put this in on your cycle? What is it that you would create as an authentic assessment? And if anyone puts a 1 hour sit down essay, then I'll need them to explain that to me and the rest of the 98 people online why they've chosen that. Okay, so can you put down in the chat what you think would be authentic assessment that would help you and them to know as acceptable evidence that they are working their way through and have worked their way through the form of troublesome knowledge you have identified as the bottleneck. Give you a couple of minutes for that, because that's a little bit trickier. But please do put your ideas in the chat. And since we are scheduled to finish at 10:30, we've allowed 10 minutes for open discussion on this, so we can have questions and answers. And that can include people like Jamie. And I know Michael Barani is in one of the participants as well, who's a very experienced, in fact, a very recent, proud to say, award-winning educator in Scotland, who's just won an RHS prize. But you'll have more from Michael later as well. So okay, anyone would like to pitch in?
I'll read out what's in the chat. I guess also, if people have questions, just put them in the chat and I'll happily.
Well, you know what, I'm going to end these so we can actually show our faces and think about this. Just before you do, Jamie, can I just say, here's something about authentic assessment just to end up on. Please do become familiar with the phrase authentic assessment. Authentic assessment, very simple overview. It's about what you think students should know in the moment, what is important for them to know and do, but also importantly, to have an enduring understanding, that it is memorable. Okay. Jamie, would you like to?
I'll start reading out some chat, and if anyone wants to speak, actually speak, I'll put their hands up. Right.
Yeah, I'll stop the screen share.
Short individual presentation, but you need to take care of people's individual abilities to present.
Yeah, that's from Sue, was it? I saw that.
That's from Tony.
Oh, was it? Sorry, I saw one from Sue flash up there. Thank you, Sue, as well.
Split the class into groups that discuss and unravel information by listening to one another and then feeding back to the rest of the class. So that makes sense, that you kind of break them down and then allow them to kind of test their ideas out on one another. For understanding content and presentation, they need those skills as a historian, and explaining a concept to others is a great way to show understanding. Max, who's also one of our speakers, who'll be speaking in a few minutes, a source analysis for of some form, traditional I know, but students can respond, possibly using some software to annotate the text to demonstrate the understanding of context and understanding. Victoria, come up with a research question and reflect on it. What gap does it address? Which method and why? What kind of sources would he use? So yeah, devising a question based on what you're kind of grappling with. Given that my troublesome knowledge will be challenging the authenticity of sources, my assessment will be an argument for and against the information being true or false or elements thereof. That's
can I just thank you for that? Can I just pitch in on this? This is not just about sources, but also about arguments and understanding other perspectives. And because I'm a football fan, I listen to Radio 5 for my sins, right? 5 Live, and they have a lovely game called Defending the Indefensible. And what I would sometimes ask students to do for 20 seconds is to actually say what they would do to defend a particular point of view or perspective. So it could be about an aspect of foreign policy or whatever it is. You could put a proposition to them and ask them, what is the argument for and supportive of that proposition? And it could be something which we might think is quite outrageous. So defending the indefensible is quite a good game. And so long as people understand that this is not necessarily your position, and it's not a position that you're proposing, you know, because it might be quite outrageous and offensive, it allows people to get into the minds of others who might think that way. Sorry, Jamie, please carry on.
No, I guess it's that going back to one of the first things that people said was around empathy being a kind of threshold concept. So for reading primaries, this is from Kate, for reading primary sources, have them bring in a short news article, even something for social media, and in a short presentation, share what they've been able to interpret from it. So bring in external information. Mini primary source analysis task from Sue. Presentation on seminar reading and its connection to their research project, perhaps assessing them while they lead a seminar discussion. Kiara, ask them to find particular parts of a primary source and write up their interpretation of it. Michelle, short critical paper. Erin, Erin's bottleneck was critical reading. The assessment is a book review aimed at social media, video/images, focusing on the key elements that they thought worked. Like I'm just thinking that all this, I will make sure we get all this written up and somehow processed and shared with people.
Jamie, can you and I sit down and look through all of these, because I think this is marvelous stuff. I've deliberately left a little bit of time because I know we're going to start with the next presenter at 10:30, aren't we?
Yes.
I'm going to say something for about 2 or 3 minutes, if I may, and that's all. And then we can I just say that what you have all done is this: you have linked pedagogic theory to practice. And very often you find that when you start a new job in higher education, certainly in the UK, they will ask you to do a postgraduate certificate in higher education, which asks that you use pedagogic theories to think about being innovative in your practice. And that ranges from the ways in which you use technology to think about assessments and so on and so forth. And I'm hoping that this morning's session has shown you that actually, although it sounds a little bit daunting or well, gosh, it's a bit of a pain, but I'm hoping that you can see that you have now used 3 educational theories to think through how you can address transition. Because thinking back to being 18, hundreds of miles away from home, thinking that you were a big fish in a small pond when you were in the 6th form, and now arriving to uncertainty and not being a big fish, and also unknowing, is one of the things that you're going to have to think about what you will do. Certainly, I used to put my students in groups of 4. When I was in Leeds, tell them, which bus they should go on, make a short film about the history of 19th century Leeds in groups of 4, interview someone. So we talked about interview processes, oral history. We looked at the sources for the history of Leeds and so on and so forth. So we linked the academic work to the educational theory and to the practice. And students found that really quite memorable. They talked about the short film that they'd made, but more importantly, they got to know 3 other people immediately and had exchanged numbers and worked collaboratively. So there's an example of linking a whole number of pedagogic theories and sense of belonging to practice. But the final thing I'll say, if I may, is that you should be aware of the Quality Assurance Agency, which is the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency's History Benchmark Statement. These benchmark statements started over a decade ago and have been through various iterations. The most recent one came out in March this year. And what I want to say about the History Benchmark Statement is this: it is not prescriptive. It is a guidance document. It is there to help you, not to act as a straitjacket. But I would recommend that every single one of you read it. It's got new and useful sections on diversity, on sustainability, and many other things, including assessment. But it's an enabling document. It's to show you what is possible for you in teaching undergraduate historians. And it will give you plenty of ideas. But what the final punchline of my session is, if you want to know more about any of these subjects or others on educational theory and their links to practice in the classroom with your students, please do not hesitate to get in touch with either me or with Jamie Wood. We'll be most happy to point you in the right direction. We know of many people in our discipline who are doing innovative and excellent work, and there's no harm in having conversations and networks. In fact, at the University of Hertfordshire, we're starting one on the International Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, where we invite people from all disciplines to share best practice. So if you want to know more about that, please do contact me. I'll be happy to include you in our network. Thanks, Jamie. I think I'm perfectly to time, so I'll end there.
Thank you, Peter. That was great. Thank you. That really instructive as well. And I've added the link to the QAA subject benchmark statement into the chat, so people can follow that up if they want.
Thank you. Whoever said it was excellent, please tell my boss. Thank you. That was Gavern.
Yeah, great. Some really good feedback coming in the chat.
Always good to get praise at my age.
Great stuff.